Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. This time, we're going to be going deep on geopolitics. We've had a lot of requests for a deep dive that focuses on, well, Russia and Ukraine, of course, but also on Trump's foreign policy and China's growing influence in South America.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack there. Sounds good.
And to guide us, we're going to be mainly drawing from an article. It's titled Annales Geopolitica, Russia, Ukraine, EUA, China, Korea. And it's by Professor Aaron Alves. I'm excited to get into it.
Me too.
Okay, so Professor Alves really jumps right into the current situation in Ukraine. You know, he talks about that recent ballistic missile strike by Russia that hit a Ukrainian military training camp.
Right.
Tragic, of course. But it kind of seems like it exposed some other issues, some deeper issues, maybe even within the Ukrainian military itself.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, while the official Russian side, they're really focusing on how effective those missiles are, the Iskander-M missiles they used, and the heavy losses that were inflicted.
Right.
But the article really points out that, there are some discrepancies between that account and what we're hearing from within the Ukrainian military. For example, the commander of the Ukrainian ground forces, Mikhailo Chapati, he publicly denounced, the horrible consequences of the attack. And he even said he was going to hold those responsible accountable. He even hinted at, potential negligence, outdated, obsolete procedures.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was pretty strong.
So are we seeing, is this an example of some kind of infighting or tension within the Ukrainian military?
Well, it certainly adds another layer of complexity to the situation, right? Yeah. It makes you question, who's controlling the narrative here. Is this an attempt to kind of deflect blame, or is there a genuine desire to identify flaws and improve their, future operations? The fact that Tripathi actually suspended 2 high-ranking officials and then banned any kind of external gatherings after the attack, that suggests that there are concerns about both accountability and maybe even security breaches.
Okay, so what you're saying is we got to look at, who benefits from controlling this whole narrative, right?
Absolutely.
So this incident, it shows that even when you're in a conflict with, a massive external force like Russia, that internal struggles, conflicting narratives, that can all have a huge impact on what's happening on the ground.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, these tensions, they could be exploited by Russia, right? And it makes it harder for Ukraine to present this united front, which in turn can affect Europe's position in this conflict.
Right. Let's talk about Europe then. Professor Alves, he really kind of argues that Europe is kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. They want solutions, but they're so dependent on the U.S. for security.
Yeah.
He even points to that recent proposal by France and the UK, for a partial truce. He says that's evidence of this dependence.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, that proposal, you could definitely see that as an attempt to just buy some time, avoid direct confrontation with Russia.
Yeah.
Without strong U.S. backing. And then Macron's admission, when he said that European forces would only actually go into Ukraine after a peace agreement is already in place, I mean, that just further emphasizes their hesitation to act on their own,
Yeah. They want to show they can be autonomous.
They do.
But they just can't compete militarily with Russia without the U.S.
Yeah. And that's a huge factor.
Okay, so Europe's in a tough spot. That's clear.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, according to Professor Alves, this isn't really helped by Trump's foreign policy. He actually argues that Trump's approach, with all the sanctions and threats, that might actually be strengthening China's position globally.
Yeah, I mean, he uses sanctions and threats a lot, right?
Yeah.
But it might actually be pushing countries toward China. While Trump's all about, tariffs and sanctions, China's over there quietly offering better trade deals, less political interference. Particularly in South America, we see this.
Oh, wow. So the U.S. is demanding they fall in line politically, and China's saying, hey, we can make it worth your while economically.
It's a very different approach. And Professor Alves, he uses this really interesting example with Argentina. President Milei initially condemned China, right?
Right.
But then during his time as president, we've seen this massive increase in exports from Argentina to China.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So it's the guy starts out all anti-China, but then economic reality hits and he's got to make deals.
It really shows you that national interest, especially when it comes to money, often trumps ideology, realpolitik, and China seems to get that. They know how to use it.
So by focusing on these immediate wins and using these pressure tactics, the argument is that Trump might actually be clearing the way for China to have more influence in the long term in places like South America.
It's a possibility. I mean, Professor Alves definitely suggests that. He says China is taking advantage, stepping into the void left by the declining U.S. influence in the region.
And how are they doing that? What's their approach?
Well, for one, they're investing heavily in infrastructure,
Hmm.
and they're working on trade deals that make them a crucial economic partner. Plus, they don't have the same baggage, the history that the U.S. has in the region. They're offering opportunities without demanding political loyalty. That's appealing to a lot of South American leaders.
Yeah, that makes sense. Especially given, the history of U.S. involvement in the region. It's not always been, the most positive.
It's a complicated history.
Yeah, very
A
complicated.
lot of baggage there.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really fascinating point, about the baggage that the U.S. carries with it, especially when we start to think about, the current situation on the Korean Peninsula with, Trump deploying the USS Carl Vinson to South Korea. I mean, that's a pretty clear message, right? Like, here's our military strength.
Oh, yeah. It's definitely show of force, but Professor Alice points out, there's more to it than just that.
Okay. What else is going on there?
Well, it's also about, reinforcing those alliances, doing those joint military exercises with South Korean forces.
Right.
And if we zoom out a little bit, look at the bigger picture, it's definitely part of this effort to counter China, their growing influence in the whole Indo-Pacific region. They're trying to strengthen ties with countries like Japan, Australia, South Korea, basically create this like strategic counterweight to China's ambitions.
So it's like a two birds, one stone kind of thing. Deter North Korea and also just send a strong message to those U.S. allies like, hey, we're here. We got your back.
Exactly. Show them they're not alone.
Okay, but how do you think China's going to react to this, More U.S. presence right on their doorstep. That can't feel good.
Well, Professor Alves, he thinks we're probably going to see a mix of things from China. Some diplomatic maneuvering, for sure. Maybe even increased military spending.
Yeah.
I mean, we can expect the usual, right? Protests, condemnations, that kind of thing, all done through official channels. But behind the scenes, you can bet they'll be bolstering their own military capabilities in the region. It's this delicate balance where each side's trying to project strength without accidentally starting a war,
Right.
It's a high-stakes game for sure.
It is. And it's even more complicated when you factor in, the personalities involved, right? We're talking about Trump and Kim Jong-un, two leaders who, well, let's just say they're not exactly known for being predictable.
No, not at all. They've both shown they're willing to take risks, say provocative things, trying to figure out their next move. It's like trying to predict the weather. Yeah, there are patterns, maybe some clues, but it's ultimately you just never really know.
Unpredictability, that just throws another wrench in the works.
It really does.
Okay, so it seems like, looking at all of this, are we at some kind of turning point in international relations? Like, we're seeing these alliances shift, these new global powers emerging, It feels like the whole global order is kind of in flux.
Yeah, it does feel that way. Professor Alves, he argues that there's this fundamental shift happening in the balance of power. The U.S. is still a major player, obviously, but they're facing challenges, both from inside and out. The division within the U.S. itself, that inconsistency in leadership, that's definitely hurting their credibility on the global stage,
Right.
And that creates an opportunity for countries like China to kind of reshape things, change the geopolitical landscape.
And they seem to be doing that, right? Like, they're using their economic power, their tech advancements, and their diplomatic skills to expand their influence all over the place.
Yeah, they're not just flexing their military muscles, they're playing the long game,
Yeah.
building relationships, securing their interests through like economic partnerships and strategic investments.
So it's less about brute force and more about, like, a smarter approach.
Exactly. They're thinking long term, building those strategic partnerships.
Yeah.
And that approach, it's working. They're expanding their influence without triggering the same kind of pushback that you usually get with, military intervention.
So it's not just about who has the biggest army anymore. Influence is about, like, who has the economic leverage, the technological edge, and who can build those key partnerships.
It's a whole different game now.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It seems like the world it's moving away from this, like, one superpower dominating everything. It's becoming more, multipolar, where power is more spread out.
That's a key takeaway for sure. And I think what's interesting is that Professor Alves doesn't try to paint this simple black and white picture of the future. He really pushes us to think critically about all the different forces at play. It's not about whether the U.S. is losing its grip or if China's taking over. It's more about understanding these dynamic shifts in power and recognizing that the old ways of doing things, they might not work anymore.
So it's about recognizing the nuances, the gray areas, understanding that everything's connected.
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting, right? It's not about finding easy answers. It's about giving us the knowledge and the tools
Yeah.
to make sense of this complicated world.
And ultimately, it's about empowering people to have these important conversations, to help shape the future they want to see. Okay, so as we're wrapping up this part of our deep dive, what are some of the big takeaways you want our listeners to think about? What are the key insights they should remember? For me, I think one of the big things is, we can't look at these events as if they're totally separate, right? The missile strike in Ukraine, the political stuff happening in South America, even the military deployments in Korea, they're all connected, even if it's not obvious at first.
Yeah, that's so important. It's like, imagine this giant web, right? You pull on one little thread, and it can cause these ripples that go out everywhere.
Yeah.
If we want to understand what's going on in the world, we got to understand those connections.
And it's not just about understanding, right? I feel like Professor Alves is really saying, hey, we got to go beyond just knowing about these things. We have to actually get involved, try to shape the future.
Yes.
But the thing is, there's so much information out there and everyone's saying something different. Where do we even begin? How do we actually do that?
Right. It's like information overload is a real problem.
Yeah.
But I think the first thing is we got to make sure we're getting information from lots of different places, right? Don't just rely on one news source or only listen to people who agree with you.
So basically, get out of our echo chambers, right? Go out and find different perspectives, even if they make us uncomfortable.
Exactly. And you got to be willing to question what you think. Be open to learning new things.
Be open to being wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, sometimes just talking to people about these issues, that could be really powerful. Share what you're learning, ask questions, encourage people to think critically.
So engagement starts with those conversations, being willing to listen to different viewpoints, even challenging each other's ideas, but respectfully.
Exactly.
What about on a larger scale? What are some ways people can get more involved, make a bigger impact?
Well, think about getting involved with some organization that's working on something you care about. You could volunteer, donate to a good cause, or even speak up for policies you believe in.
Yeah, write to your elected officials, go to town hall meetings, even participate in, peaceful protests.
All of that makes a difference. And don't forget about the choices you make every day. You can support businesses that align with your values and choose not to spend money at ones that don't. You know what I mean?
Right. So, be a conscious consumer.
Exactly. Your choices, they reflect what you care about, and they can make a difference.
It's kind of empowering to realize that we're not powerless in the face of all these huge global challenges, Every conversation, every action, every choice we make, it all adds up.
I think that's really what Professor Alves is trying to get at. We're not just watching this all happen, we're part of it. We can help create the future.
So to wrap up this deep dive, I think the message is, the world is complicated. It's always changing and it's all connected. And if we want to navigate it, we got to be informed, we got to be engaged, and we got to be willing to question what we think we know.
Absolutely.
Right?
And there are no easy answers, right? All these things we talked about, they're complicated. There are a lot of different sides to every story. If we just think about it like, us versus them, we're never going to find real solutions.
Right.
We need to embrace the fact that it's messy, it's uncertain, and there's a lot we don't know.
Right.
We need to be willing to really listen to each other, consider different perspectives, and understand that it's not always black and white.
Yeah. It's about understanding that we all have a responsibility to try to make the world a better place, more just, more peaceful, and more sustainable. And not just for us, but for the generations that come after us.
Well said.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you learned something new and maybe feel inspired to go out there and make a difference.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep making the world a better place. We'll see you next time.